So we're here to talk about Inside Llewyn Davis, which I don't know. I don't think we've ever talked about before. So I'll be curious to hear your thoughts. For me, it is one of my favorite movies of all time. I think it is arguably the Coen Brothers' best film, and I think it's one of the best movies of the 2010s. And we'll talk about why. I have a weird history with this movie. It feels like it was specifically made for me, and kind of just has all of my favorite things in it. But I'm curious, when did you first see this? What are your kind of general thoughts on the film and the Coen Brothers in general?
Well, also for a little context to our listeners, we are in the process of preparing a Bob Dylan episode. That's a little bit more in depth, but leading up to that, we also wanted to, revisit. Also, in the wake of A Complete Unknown, the movie that basically is a real, it's to me more of a Bob Dylan movie than A Complete Unknown. I feel like Inside Llewyn Davis is about the myth of the musician and the real nuts and bolts and the work of it, as opposed to the Wikipedia article of a biopic, which tends to be, most of these films these days. Not actually dogging on A Complete Unknown, because I did enjoy it. It's just, I feel like Inside Llewyn Davis is a far richer and more textural film because of the challenges that lay in front of him that he just can't seem to get ahead of, as opposed to A Complete Unknown, which is kind of, for as interesting as it is, if you're a Bob Dylan head, there's not a lot of conflict in that movie. The conflict is that he's about to get famous, and then he gets famous.
Right. And it's funny
Yeah.
because, and I also like A Complete Unknown as well. I do think it's like one of the better versions of these types of movies. But like, it's funny that, like, I mean, it's obviously in the title as well, but like, it's a movie about how Bob Dylan is ultimately unknowable. And there are two movies that make that their text, as opposed to sort of just saying it over and over again.
Yep.
Like, I'm not
Yeah.
I'm not there, and Inside Llewyn Davis are about Bob Dylan without being about Bob Dylan. And
Sure.
that feels like a better approach when you're making a movie that essentially says that this guy cannot be understood.
Sure. And additionally, even just from the dramaturgy standpoint, like, I knew about the Newport Folk Festival, kind of conflict, if you want to even call it that. It sounds just like a rough night at a venue, from a musician standpoint. But it's one of those things that, like, I grew up hearing about, watching VH1 behind the music, or like the 100 most shocking moments in rock and roll, like that kind of thing. So it was already out in the ether, and to see it dramatized, obviously, even the VH1 accounts, or just when this would kind of pop up in anecdotally and like pop culture stuff, they try to make it sound like this very dramatic thing. And I'm sure that at the time it was, for what that festival was. But again, it's like, how do you turn this into cinema? Whereas I feel like Inside Llewyn Davis is a lot freer, in that, you're in the milieu of it, but you're not bogged down by the biographical, talking points. You have somebody that, for every Bob Dylan, there were a million people that weren't Bob Dylan and had the same aspirations and maybe the same influences. So with that, I just wanted to give that disclaimer, to the listeners. But Chad, to answer your earlier question, my exposure to this movie was that I just saw it when it came out, and initially when I did, I I think, having seen A Serious Man before that, I was expecting, something a lot more, madcap, in the way that you expect from a Coen Brothers film, where it's serious, but, it has this weird fever pitch to it. There's larger than life characters, and this is really a departure for them. Not necessarily, in terms of them doing folk music, which you could argue that Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is kind of a precursor to this, or at least shows that the Coen brothers have an appreciation for, the traditions of American music. but also just that it's such a dry film, and it's so unrelenting, and it reminds me of A Serious Man in the sense that in that there seems to be some external force that is preventing this person from accomplishing their goal, and is almost being mocked by it. But it approaches it from a very different perspective, and I think from just personally as a musician, it's like it's a far more humanist film about just the hardship of wanting to not only make art but make a living off it.
Yeah, and like, I've never bought into the criticism of the Coens that they are, too cynical and too sort of anti-humanist. I think you can just look at this movie in particular and see that that's not true. I do think the Serious Man comparison is apt, and the other film that this reminds me of, and it's kind of my three favorite films of theirs, is Barton Fink.
Oh yeah.
And also a movie about an artist. And also all three of those movies have kind of biblical, mythic sort of, forces at play that, become more and more kind of overwhelming as the narrative goes through. And we'll talk more about kind of the sort of Sisyphean loop that like this movie kind of feels like it takes place in, whether that's
Sure,
literal or
yeah.
not. But like A Serious Man, there is this sort of like Job level, like befalling of bad circumstances on this guy, and they just kind of beat the hell out of this guy throughout the film. And I mean, it's not like he doesn't deserve it. I think we'll get to it, but I think one of the most devastating scenes is when he drives past Akron, without
Oh
saying
God.
anything,
Yeah. I was watching
and
it
just
last
kind of
night and I
lets
was
that
like, God
happen.
damn, dude, that's
Yeah.
well, can we get into spoilers or
Yeah, I think we should talk through the whole film. It's
of
a it's
course, of
a it's
course.
a
Yeah.
12-year-old movie. So my kind of history with this film is, I, as like am kind of a Bob Dylan obsessive, and like most
Sure.
of my musical knowledge and taste sort of stems from that tree, either like, and a lot of the music that I like and consume is either was influenced on him, or he influenced, or are his peers essentially.
I've always scolded you that you need to unwatch 100 movies and listen to 100 more records.
I know, you're
But
right.
yeah.
And maybe through this podcast that will happen. Exactly. I need to erase 100 from my brain and get myself 100 more albums. Uh, but yes, so, there's that. And then there's, my, I, the movie that Oscar Isaac starred in, right before this one, I directed. So, my first movie, my first feature was called Revenge for Jolly, and it starred and was written by my friend Brian Petzos, and his kind of cousin and buddy and counterpart in the film. We cast Oscar Isaac for, and this was Drive had premiered at Cannes, but I don't think it had come out yet.
Right.
And so we really kind of got him in like a little pocket of window before he got super famous. But, I loved working with him, and, we are still, certainly friendly to this day. And, that movie unfortunately was taken away from me and re-edited by a bunch of scumbag producers.
Sure.
So it's not something that I would really go tell our listeners to go watch, but Brian and Oscar are very funny and good in it. But yes, so I was around him and seeing him a lot around this time in 2011 and 12. And I remember when he got this part, and I was so excited for him. And the word was out that the Coens were looking for someone that could really sing and play guitar, and they wanted to record the music live on set, and also kind of have complete songs, sang, performed from start to finish, which is something else that I love about the movie. So when he got this part and was auditioning for it, he kind of like went all in on it, and started performing in little clubs like in the village, to just practice and get his chops up and do all of these things. And so, I got to see him perform at a bunch of these little venues with 10 or 15 people in them. And a few times, Joel Coen and Frances McDormand would be there too. And I was always too scared to talk to them, but I sat near them during some of these.
You would have fartled so hard. It's like, remember that time?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, what do you even say to these people? You know what I mean? Like,
simple.
Remember how
that was
in Barton
awesome.
Fink the walls catch on fire at the end? That was awesome. So yeah, so I was really primed to love this movie, and I finally saw it, I think like opening weekend in New York. I missed it at the New York Film Festival. I don't know why. I must have been shooting something or something like that. And so I saw it I think in December at the Regal Union Square. And what struck me about it at first was everyone was talking about like a kind of like a movie about the folk music scene, and of course it is that, and I think it's fairly accurately depicted, but I also, it's first and foremost a Coen Brothers movie. It's a movie that is their themes and their humor and their philosophy that's like sort of set in the backdrop of this scene. And once, as I was watching it and kind of realized that, like, it just really it kind of like taught me how to watch the movie. And then where so you're thinking of like, this movie is about the folk music scene in the 60s, in the same way that Barton Fink is about Hollywood in the 30s. You know
Sure.
what I mean? Like, it's kind of a backdrop and a setting. Oh, the other thing that I should mention is that I did kind of affect this movie in a strange and circuitous way, is that the reason that the actor Stephen Payne, the great Stephen Payne, who is the deep voiced cowboy who punches Oscar in both the beginning and the end of the film, or maybe in the same scene that's repeated over and over again. Sure. The reason he is in this movie is because I cast him in Revenge for Jolly, and then Oscar recommended him to the Coen Brothers to cast in this movie.
So
I think that originally, because the guy Steven does look and sound a fair amount like Sam Elliott.
Sure.
And I think that might have been a situation where they were going to have Sam Elliott just play that part, and then he couldn't for whatever reason. And so Steven got it. But that was always a kind of like fun little thing to me, that Steven has this great monologue in Revenge for Jolly that kind of like sums up the end of the film. And I worked with him a few times on a few other things, and he's also a Greenwich Village mainstay. If you are ever walking around McDougal Street, you might just see him. But he's a great guy and a great actor, and so it's cool that he was part of the movie. Also, very interestingly, he thinks the movie is bad.
Oh, wow.
Which I think has to do with like his sort of, either he doesn't think it's accurate, or he thinks that there's a bunch of, fancy philosophical bullshit in it, or what. But I've never gotten the full kind of take from him. But he wasn't a fan of it. I think he won't care that I'm saying this, but he's an interesting guy. But yeah, so that was kind of like my intro into the film, and then I was also uh later that month or around that same time they did a one night only concert at Town Hall in Midtown. And I think the film is on the Blu-ray. There's a concert film of it, but I got to go to that live, which was still like one of the best shows I've ever seen. Where John Goodman hosted it. They had everybody from Joan Baez and Jack White and the Mumford and Sons and the Avett Brothers and a bunch of great people play. And it was just like a packed bill of like all these great musicians singing these great like folk songs. And it was a really amazing thing to see. So yeah, I mean, I really love this movie. It kind of like I think explains a lot of my personality, like in terms of musical taste, but also it's kind of like melancholy and cynicism I respond to really strongly. And yeah, I mean, I think we can kind of get into like how it starts. And I don't know if you've ever heard about the kind of there's a theory that the movie is essentially Groundhog Day. That like it starts and stops, it starts and ends on the same scene. And it's like you think like, oh, they're just showing you the end of the movie first, but like there's a lot of clues that like kind of make that not make sense. So I don't know, even it's an interesting way to think about the movie. It's like, it starts with him singing this great cover of a traditional called Hang Me. And I love that we just get to watch a complete musical performance it feels like this guy by the end of that song.
Yeah. I mean, as to that theory, it's funny because I that was the main thing I remembered from it from the first time I had seen it. And obviously, I watched it last night, and my reaction was, because it's like, all right, if this was to be a literal loop, and sometimes like people get too literal with things on Reddit, or just like the whole economy of fan theories now is so annoying to me. We're
yes,
like,
and I agree, and I'm not part of that at all. Yes,
totally,
right.
totally. I mean, I think that like it's a beautiful aesthetic choice to sort of make this Ouroboros narrative that kind of winds up where it begins, and to even take it a step further and to echo, or it's almost like it rhymes. This was a lyrical film. You would arrive back to that like initial theme. And I don't think that like to think about it in a literal way where this character is doomed. I was watching it with that in mind, and there are things that happen where we're like, well, this time, I mean, he learns a little bit along the way. He learns to at least close the door before the fucking cat gets out.
Exactly.
So there are little
that's
things.
The big change. Yes, he learns that.
And I do think that I mean, obviously the metaphor is that this guy is his own worst enemy, and even when opportunities present themselves, much to Casey Mulligan's character's point,
Carrie,
Carrie, sorry, yes,
yeah.
Carrie, much to Carrie Mulligan's point in the film when she tells him, things won't work out for you because you don't want them to work out. I think there's something to be said about this film being about and on the one side, it's the business of art, and selling out versus authenticity. Goals within art. I mean, he criticizes, both Mulligan and Timberlake's character for using music as a vehicle to the suburbs, and I think you never really get a sense of what he wants out of art, which I also think is like, because he doesn't have that kind of statement in the film that kind of drums home, I don't think he knows what he wants out of it. I think
Yeah.
there's never really a scene in the film that tells you, I want to make it under these circumstances, or all we know is that it's this guy stuck in mourning. He had a musical partner. The partner committed suicide. So in some ways, it's a film about, grief as well. It's a film about loss. But I do think that, this sort of Groundhog Day sort of theory, I think, is meant to obviously be metaphorical. And then, the people that kind of like, to me, there's something lizard brain about like, whoa, it ends how it starts. So the movie
Yeah.
starts over again. So I would say that, like, yeah, I think it's about how this guy's, it's the life is going to have to, throw him around a little bit more before he gets anything out of it. He seems to be a slow learner, and there are just tiny little, I mean, there is, I would almost say that cat scene is to say a tiny bit of progress in this otherwise
I think
hard-headed
100%
character's
that's true. That's the kind of tiny bit of progress that he makes, and the Coens are often really funny about their writing and the way they said something like, we wrote the first draft and realized we didn't really have a plot, so we added the cat.
Nice.
And like, and I just think that's great. And yes, I mean, it's interesting, and and we should say that, like, Llewyn is, loosely based on the real life musician Dave Van Ronk, and who has a small part in A Complete Unknown as well, or he's portrayed in like a scene or two of A Complete Unknown, and he was a great folk singer who was in Greenwich Village at the time, and was a sort of friend and of Dylan's, and but struggled and never really made it his whole life. I just read an article that mentioned how you in the as late as the 90s you could still see flyers that were like, learn guitar from Dave Van Ronk.
Yeah.
So he has a few albums that are really great. He has an incredible voice. It's funny because, Oscar doesn't look or sound like him at all.
Right.
Obviously, they were kind of doing their own thing, but even the like, Inside Llewyn Davis, the album, the cover of it is definitely a recreation of Inside Dave Van Ronk, which was his main album. I don't know if it was his debut or not, but that's the kind of like most famous one. And then he also wrote an autobiography of the time, which they drew a lot of details from. But the big thing is, and at least Llewyn Davis, he never sings an original. Like, he doesn't write his music, right? And like, that is the I think the big difference of when Dylan came in and sort of electrified this whole scene, was that a lot of these people were playing traditionals, folk song, like as he says in the movie, if it never gets old and was never new, it's a folk song. So like,
Right.
they're singing like either traditionals from like the American Songbook or Irish songs or things like that, where Dylan comes in and he's writing in those same idioms, but he's
It's like reinventing
doing
the
it
form.
exactly, and he's doing it about contemporary themes, and like that's what like put him above everyone else. And he's singing these songs that like sound like they could be 100 years old, but they're about things that are happening right now.
Right.
And so that's when and the movie ends, of course, with Llewyn seeing Dylan tune up for the
Of
first time
course.
in the Gaslight,
Yeah.
which is so cool.
Fare thee
And
well.
I
Yeah.
you should have seen me like gripping my seat like the moment that happened in the theater. doing the Leo and in Once Upon a Time pointing of, that's Dylan right there. Um, so yeah, I all of these things I'm sort of obsessed with, and I'm curious for you, like some of the business of music stuff, like I'm sure you have had experience where if you'd rather take the cash or the royalty, or having to schlep your shit, like across the country only for a
Or
shitty
pay for an
meeting or
abortion
whatever.
in the
Yeah, well, yes.
Never done that
uh
one, but I
yeah,
could tell
good.
you that, like, I mean, sometimes taking the money as opposed to, getting points. I mean, here's the thing. There's so many things that this movie captures, even before you get to the business side of it, but just the fundamentals of life as a gigging musician. And I've talked about this with my brother. I've talked about this with my dad. I've talked about it with different, musicians. But there is a certain point where, especially when you're just a gigging musician, meaning that you're doing pickup gigs, you're like playing in wedding bands, or you're doing, nights with different bands, cover bands, maybe stepping in for a studio session, you're recording on somebody else's music, or you're joining somebody else's band, but just for a tour. The chaos, the uncertainty of any long-term plan is enough to drive anyone insane. And there's moments throughout the film that, like, when he's, and I've had this conversation with my dad where, when you're at a party, when you're invited to a party, and it's under the pretense that at some point you're going to pick up a guitar and you're going to, spice things up, or you're going to sing a couple songs for them. And it actually is this really annoying fucking thing, because it's like, I completely related to Llewyn in that scene, where obviously he takes it to the next degree because he's an asshole, and that's the whole point of his characters is, he's kind of this hard-headed prick that can't get a break for that very reason. But I sympathized with him, of just like, dude, imagine having the worst day ever, and you sit down for dinner and someone's like, will you play me a song? And not only that, but play a song that that's been forbidden from the track list for obvious reasons. And people have those too. I have songs I don't perform because they're not practical to perform, but or just that you move on from. It's like Radiohead being sick of singing Creep, and it's the last thing they
Right.
want to play,
Yeah.
I think that all of those little details, are so true to the experience. And once you get into the business side of it, I mean, they also do such a great job of, like, even just little things, like, being hired on as a session player. And I'm curious about that, because most session players typically, unless it also takes an honest producer to cut them in on the publishing. There's stories of, like, Quincy Jones talking about players on Thriller that should have gotten 10% for that lick on Wanna Be Starting Something, but both him and Michael were like, fuck no. we're taking the whole pie. So it depends. Sometimes, if you've already written the composition and someone comes in and they just play on it, they just get their day rate. But if they add something new, which is a very subjective thing and it takes a lot of trust, then, you should be cut into the song itself, and therefore you'd be seeing royalties. But I don't know how it worked more specifically with the publishing back then. But I love that, he doesn't have management. He just has a publisher, and that's the only, he's the guy that he's going to, just to see if something's happening with his record. And there is that desperation too. I mean, I would say more so now, than even just a decade ago, where you have these intangibles of, you release an album and then it's this oblique thing that, especially now with streaming, you don't know. There is no tangible, there's no way to convert that data into actual capital anymore, at least in any clear sort of way, So
Yeah.
I identified
By
a little bit.
design, I imagine.
Oh,
Yeah, by
completely,
design,
yeah,
yes.
completely. I mean, there's the way in which labels now are doling out royalties, to their artists, via streams, is a black box by design. And not to get on a soapbox, but but it is something that, like, yeah, I mean, back then at the very least, you could say that, well, if you sell X amount of records, at wholesale from the record, from these record stores that buy them in bulk, you could say that, this is how many copies you've sold. But now, in the
Right.
advent of the lack of any physical medium by which you can count, and it's all just based on streams, and they have the metrics down to, well, how many seconds of the song did this person listen to? How they determine that number is completely arcane. And just for a little bit of context, obviously this film takes place in an era when, royalties were defined by radio plays, which is a mechanical standard that has existed, for well over 100 years at this point. And even the term, actually, fun fact, the term mechanical royalty comes from old Nickelodeon pianos. So if somebody had
Oh, wow.
yes, so this is like the birth of publishing stuff, where back in the day, if you had a Nickelodeon piano in your bar, saloon, or whatever, and it had certain compositions on it, it would count every time that someone pays to hear that composition. So then, the person at the publishing company would come in every week and look at the amount of plays and determine a mechanical royalty based on how many times people heard that song. So then, you evolved from, a Nickelodeon piano playing a pre-made composition to then recordings. So people applied the same standard and just said, obviously they kept the name, but that's kind of one thing that, like, that even now we still call them mechanical royalties. But it's a term that's
Wow.
like over 100 years old.
Hmm.
And what's unfortunate about, where things have gone now in the streaming era, that are kind of a perversion of, developing any sort of like standard metric, is that, essentially the way that like these streaming services, primarily I'm going to, target Spotify a little bit here just because they seem to be the main offender, but the way in which they determine what these royalties are is like a total black box. Like we don't like the number that they determine between someone at Spotify and the label is not like a clearly defined metric in the way that you had a radio a radio royalty or mechanical royalty from radio plays, that you could say, okay, every time this song plays on this station it's worth this many dollars, and then that gets doled out to the publishing company, who then pays out the composers, which would sometimes be your session players, if they contributed something to the composition, as we were saying earlier with in the case of Thriller. But what people don't know about Spotify is that, like, dude, the call is coming from inside the house, because when Spotify started, they offered equity to to these major labels in exchange for cheap access to their catalogs. So the labels are invested in the success of Spotify in the long run, even if Spotify eventually just winds up focusing on other things, whether that be podcasts, whether that be audiobooks, which you're already seeing them pivot into because they can't make heads or tails about how they're going to pay musicians out. And that was always the early promise of it. But it's fucked because, they have more data than they ever have. They know, how many seconds of the song you listen to, the third or fourth time you played it, and yet cannot determine a real number as to how to pay out that artist. And what's fucked up is that, this is why it's particularly difficult to create a union amongst musicians, is that, it's very much so. Whereas film still, for now, requires an entire production. It requires people operating at different levels. It requires a lot of investment capital to make a film. You have people with specialized skills that can then unionize, whereas music has become less and less about the studio, the session players, the engineer, the mixer, the producer, these traditional roles, and more into an individual thing. I mean, you have records that are getting made by single people in their bedrooms, and many of them go on to have great success. And I can't complain, because I that was certainly how I got my start. It was just a record I made, in a month, with like probably a cracked version of Ableton Live and one synthesizer. And it's a double-edged sword, because, if you get 100 bands to boycott something like Spotify, all it does is, because of the saturation of how many people now are able to make music and for how little money, it only incentivizes 100 other bands to step in and make up that market share. So it's kind of the only revolution that would have to happen from the top down, because the other thing that's kind of fucking weird is that, is that the bigger you are at these majors, the more of a priority you are at these majors, you can negotiate a different royalty rate. So that like the fact that it's this arcane number that happens behind closed doors, and you have maybe what people say the payout is on average. But certainly Drake or The Weeknd or Taylor Swift or somebody like this, Peso Pluma is like, they can negotiate what that number is per stream. So it would require the 5 or 6 biggest artists at least to pull themselves from these streaming services to even begin to have a conversation. Because even if you got the bottom million bands, it's not going to determine it wouldn't be the same metric as if you got like the 10 largest artists who they're not getting 0.007 per stream. They're getting a different number that they argue with their management and their legal team. So it's fucked. We had a standard, we lost it, and now it's just literally, to quote McConaughey in Wolf of Wall Street, it's a woozy, it's a wazi, it's fairy dust.
Yes, right. And it's not dissimilar in terms of residuals and back end for a film. Like people ask like, what, like, how does Killers of the Flower Moon cost $200 million? Well, it's like, well, to get the 3 of those guys to walk in a room, you're spending 60 already. And like back in the day, you look at like when Spielberg and Cruise decided to work together on both those movies, they took no upfront salary because they wanted to keep the budgets down, and they knew they were going to make a hit, and they were powerful enough to like get part of participation in first dollar grosses, and like and so even in that case as well, like them taking their salaries out of the equation actually helps them because it keeps the budget low enough that then it's like faster to recoup, but like Killers of the Flower Moon has no real ability to make money. Now, at least, Apple is better, or at least they were better at theatrical than, Netflix is, or care about it, but, we'll see. I think that if F1 doesn't perform theatrically, you might never see Apple release another movie in theaters again.
Right. This film, tying it back to Inside Llewyn Davis, it's wild to see. It's wild to see a film about, even when it worked, how fucked and hopeless it was.
Yes, right.
You apply it to today's.
Yeah, it's much worse. I don't know if you've ever had a Gate of Horn, I don't see a lot of money here type meeting, but like that is just like such a wonderfully devastating scene in the film. He goes all this way to Chicago and, goes to the Gate of Horn, which was a real place, a real club, but also is, along with the, Ulysses and all their kind of like mythic references, and plays this incredible version of the song, I think called The Death of Queen Jane. And then F. Murray Abraham just kind of takes one look at him and says, I don't see a lot of money here.
As devastating as it is, he then rejects the offer that he is handed. So again, I feel like this film constantly is about this person who who won't make it because they don't want to make it. And maybe you don't.
He's his own worst enemy. Yeah.
He's his own worst enemy because he tells him about, the group that he could put together. And I love that they do at least 2 references to Oscar Isaac looking Mexican. Because he's like, well, if you shave this down to a goatee and you stay out of the sun, maybe we could, there's that. And then there's also John Goodman's line where I forget what he's like, what's your name, Pablo, or something like that.
Right.
Like, well, my mother, he's like, I'm Greek, but my mother was Italian or something. Which I love. They must have, that's one of those little fixes in the script that reminded me of like Tarantino being like, okay, why does this guy in a Western have like an Austrian accent,
Right. So I gotta like do something about it. And I think in real life, Oscar's Guatemalan, I believe.
Yeah.
But that I did notice that this time too,
which I loved, which is hilarious.
It's so funny. Like, shave this down to a goatee and stay out of the sun.
But he's offering him a chance to be part of a trio, and to me, just from a
Hmm.
practical standpoint, it's like if you're, I mean, again, this is the difference between the session musician and the person that so-called self-proclaimed artist. Even though he never says that, he never. Again, we don't know what his goals are, other than to maybe have his record be heard. I mean, it's all implicit. Obviously, he wants his own version of success, whether that's to become the next Bob Dylan. He never really says. He seems to be
You're right, and he
allergic,
never has that scene where he's like, "I'm an artist. I have to do it." That it's like
which you have
he,
in Barton Fink.
right. Yes, that's true. And
You
like,
cretins.
yes, and no, you're right. It is interesting. I mean, you have the like, obviously, like the Please Mr. Kennedy is the sort of like Wallace Beery picture
Yeah,
of
yeah,
Barton
yeah,
Fink,
yeah.
and you do have him like grumbling and making fun of, and who wrote this about that song. But I don't know. I think that like what he wants is sort of implicit in the way that like he only kind of seems alive and able to express himself like when he's playing,
Yeah.
and so I think he wants to keep doing that, but he keeps kind of getting in his own way. I mean, I think it's interesting that his partner, his former, the part of his duo, Mike, who's I think played by uh Mumford,
Oh
Marcus
wow.
Mumford. Yes, and he is both in when we hear him and then in the photos on the album. And I don't know, I don't remember if like, because Carrie Mulligan and Marcus Mumford are married or together or whatever. So I'm not sure if they met on this
Oh.
movie or that's how each other got involved in it or
I,
what.
I'm sorry. It's
But
gonna take it
yes.
down a tiny peg for me. This the how much. I mean, I love this film regardless, but there's a certain wave of like what I like to call like clap and stomp yo ho ho core of like the late 2000s, early
Uh-huh.
2010s that seemed to overwhelm the conversation of what hipsterdom was. Because nobody
Yes,
that
and
I
Mumford
knew
and Sons is
had an ironic
primarily responsible
mustache
for
and
this. Yes.
yes, completely, 100%. There's like Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros. There's other bands that literally is just a sort of
Yes.
like clap, stomp, clap, stomp. When your band, if your band has a guy whose job is to just play the floor tom and go oh, you're in a yo ho ho core band. Okay, so I can't stand that. I didn't like it then. I don't like it now, even though I'm sure that with fucking TikTok and indie sleaze that's the next thing that's probably coming back is people who look like barbers, even if they play in bands. But yeah, okay, sorry. That was just my
All
little
right.
side rant about Mumsford and
This
Sons.
is I informed you on real time that this movie is Mumford and Sons adjacent,
Very
and
adjacent, yeah.
it's losing half a star now. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Uh, but Mike, uh, it's never revealed or discussed like why Mike jumped off the George Washington Bridge,
Right.
not the Brooklyn Bridge, and I think that it's very interesting, and I think that like I think part of that is obviously he's grieving his friend, but I think there's also something to it that's kind of unspoken that he's like thinking, if he did that, why shouldn't I? You
Right.
know? And I remember I had talked to Oscar after he had shot the movie, but before it had come out, and he really wasn't sure what it was gonna be. He said, there are a lot of scenes of me just like sitting there looking or thinking
Right.
or kind of looking out a window or contemplating or whatever. And I have to say that I really think that he nails those things because it and the way they employ them in editing, like you do. I never feel like I don't know what he's going through. He's not
Right.
inscrutable, like in the way that like Bob Dylan is or whatever. Like
Right.
it's a really deeply felt film, I think, even though it is dry and cold in some ways too, because it's very minimal. But like, I think like the best folk music, it's very minimal but deeply felt.
Right. Which is hard to do with somebody else's music. I mean,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
interesting that you bring that up because I wasn't sure. That wasn't something that I knew specifically about the film. If they had brought in a writer, or if they were just playing
No,
traditional folk songs.
the only original song in the film is "Please, Mr. Kennedy."
Right. Of course.
Yes.
Um, I mean, and here's the thing. It's like I mean, I like folk music. I don't have that tradition with it, so I don't know the deep cuts. And it was interesting to watch it, not necessarily knowing if he's just an interpreter. But that is something that, again, to this film's credit, like I've asked my dad several times over the years, like, hey, why don't you write us, let's write a song together. And there was always a sort of very formal response. He's like, I'm not a composer, I'm a singer. And
Right.
this is a different,
Interesting.
this was a different era also when, again, not to bring it back to somebody like Frank Sinatra, but that was the standard, is that you had a beautiful voice, an interpreter, and you had,
Correct.
and
then
yeah,
you had like, you know, you had the guys in the back that wrote the songs. You know
yeah,
what I mean?
yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, and I mean, similar with film as well. I mean, like it used to be a rarity that you would have a writer director.
sure,
Like, and the few sort of famous ones from back in the day like were an anomaly, like
right,
Preston Sturges, Billy Wilder, Sam Fuller. Like these are fairly early writer directors, in the 40s and 50s. But like John Ford never wrote a movie. Like
sure.
that's just like not what he did.
And only podcast nerds will know who
Oh, and
wrote those
I should
scripts, man.
Orson Welles. Certainly, Orson Welles is another one
Well,
as
yeah,
well that I
for
should
sure.
mention. But the other three guys, and but when Orson Welles came onto the scene, like that was I think like you're turning over an era, like at that point. It's
Yeah,
like and so and the other three guys were all basically just screenwriters that like got sick of people fucking up their scripts, so they like started directing them.
right.
So
I
yeah,
mean,
I
you
think
could.
it's similar with what Bob Dylan did. You could say that Bob Dylan was the Orson Welles of his time.
Well, but if you bring it back to A Complete Unknown, the first chunk of the film, he's trying to get his songs recorded and pressed,
Right.
right? But
Yes.
initially they wanted
Because
to.
Dylan's first album is almost all traditionals. I believe there are
Oh yeah,
two originals on there. But like yes, like that's what he was kind of forced to do by Columbia, even though he had written all these songs and was performing them live. Like that was kind of unheard of. And then you have his second album, which is his real breakthrough, which is the Freewheelin'. And those are, I think, all, if not certainly the vast majority of,
yeah.
are all original songs by him.
Well, you could also say that, I mean, it's the music world's version of paying your dues, or at least that's how it traditionally kind of worked, because you see this in a lot of other movies. You see this in like that fucking insane Nick Nolte Buddy Holly movie. You kind of you see this in other representations where people kind of originally start out.
I haven't seen that.
Oh wow, the Buddy Holly story. Oh wait, no. Maybe
Oh
it's not Nick
yeah.
Nolte. It's
Oh, it's Gary Busey. That's why
yes.
I
Sorry.
was
Well, yeah. These
yes,
two
yes.
faces are very fungible. So it's
Two
yeah.
kind of crazy people. Yeah.
But it starts out. It's
Yes,
a very
I've heard of that.
traditional.
I've
Yeah,
heard it's good. I haven't seen it.
it's great. And Gary Busey does all the guitar playing in it. I mean, he gets into the role. But one of the cliches of making music in that time is that well. Let's play one of mine.
And I mean, I think that makes sense, but it's also very interesting that it's like in this pure, story about a kind of like pure artist who like, is resistant to compromise and resistant to, selling out until he's really desperate. But like, it's sort of an interesting choice that he's not a songwriter, like that
Yeah.
would be what you would maybe think to do. And that's sort of like why I love that. Like, it's so Coen Brothers to do a movie about the 60s folk scene, and instead of making it about Bob Dylan, they make it about Dave Von Rock.
Yeah,
Like, they make it about the guy that never made it.
sure.
Like, that's just so them. And we get to kind of see the beginnings of that kind of era shift at the end of the movie. But it's I don't know, it's a great way to kind of like see this world. I also remember when I never got to visit the set or anything, but like, they were shooting this obviously in the village, and like,
Sure.
you could walk through and see, you could walk down McDougal Street and see how they had like transformed it. And it was amazing to see. I mean, we should say that, like, it's an interesting time in the Coens career, because they were coming off of, you know, they've had such a sort of interesting run, like where, they have their sort of like most fallow period of, Intolerable Cruelty and The Lady Killers, and then, the kind of only movies of theirs that ever got like really bad reviews. And even though I think Intolerable Cruelty is actually good and underrated, but and then they come back with No Country for Old Men. That's
Sure.
their follow up to The Lady Killers. And then sort of after that, like, almost immediately squander like and all of their sort of critical goodwill, and certainly goodwill from the Academy, with Burn After Reading, which I think now people
Oh yeah.
love and sort of see the value in. But like at the time, even me, like, I mean, we kind of thought it was like a joke that they had released this. And now I think it's like a totally prescient, and like we're basically living in the world of Burn After Reading as
Oh
we
yeah.
speak. And then they do A
Well,
Serious
it's
Man.
kind of
And
like their Doctor Strangelove in a way,
yes, I think that's a great comparison. And then, A Serious Man was definitely more of like an indie thing. And then they have True Grit, which I love, and is by far their biggest commercial hit. And I think like with that, the success of that, they're sort of able to get something as kind of mercurial as Inside Llewyn Davis like off the ground. But like, it's not too long after that they're kind of done. Like,
Right.
they do Hail Caesar, which flops.
Sure.
And then The Ballad of Buster Scruggs is a streaming movie, and an
Then they
anthology
break
film
up,
at that. And then they
basically.
break up, and
Yeah.
like, and Joel makes another basically streaming movie, that's, essentially, it's just him doing a play that he filmed. And
Right.
then, Ethan makes one of the worst movies of 2024, with Drive-Away Dolls.
Sure.
They both start making movies with their wives, and sort of, I think and hope that they will get back together. But like, it's a very weird time. It just felt like very quickly they went from, the best and most important, among the best and most important directors in American cinema, to like, now I don't even think people knew Macbeth or Drive Away Dolls came out,
Right.
and like that happened in like in like a less than 10-year period. It's very interesting. I hope that there's a kind of reunification and comeback that happens.
Well, I mean, as to your point about the the Sisyphean myth,
Sisyphean.
yeah, the Sisyphean,
Sisyphean. Yeah.
the
Yes.
Sisyphean myth. I mean, to some extent, and this from making films, but you're pushing a rock up a fucking mountain every single time, and maybe in a way there is something in this film that is this kind of somber examination of the relationship between the creative process, putting yourself out there, being open to criticism, and its intersection with commerce. I mean, to me, this film, whether it's made by musicians or not, it's certainly made by people who have been chewed up and spit out several times by the industry that they continue to survive in. So
You're
it could
right.
mark the end of
And
a period.
I think you're right, and I mean, it's also what is it about? It's about the breakup of a partnership. It's about the grieving
Yeah.
of a breakup of a
Woo.
partnership, like through suicide. But like, I don't know. I mean, there's something there to that.
Wait,
Like,
Chad, are you saying that the Coen brothers are the oasis of director duos?
I don't know.
Well, Neil,
I
yeah.
I
I don't know. Well, are you familiar with the Oasis beef? I mean, that's why the company.
yes,
Yeah,
I
okay,
mean,
okay, okay.
I'm familiar with how they are two like crazy people and kind of hate each other's guts and are always fighting, right? And breaking up. But like I'm not really aware of what their dynamic is. I mean, like who does what in Oasis and like what's the beef exactly?
I mean, it's just two brothers that can't stand each other, and
Right, okay.
it's I don't know if uh I think Liam Gallagher is like the most vocally obnoxious of them, and I even saying this now, he will find some snippet of this that he can then tweet back at, like fuck you, or whatever, because he's very vocal on Twitter.
He's very online.
He's
Okay.
very
Yeah.
online, yeah. But it is kind of this thing where I always think of that Paul Thomas Anderson line where they ask him why he works with a lot of the same actors, and he's like, well, it's like a band. Like the more you play, the better you sound.
Yeah.
So any sort of creative partnership after, I mean, most bands break up after 3 albums, dude. They break up after a
Right.
decade. So
Yeah.
obviously, when you're family, it's different. You look at the Sparks Brothers. That's another band that it's two siblings. I play with my brother.
Yeah.
So it is this thing where like that helps keep it together just by the virtue of like, well, you're always gonna have to see each other at Thanksgiving and Christmas,
Right, right.
regardless of
Exactly.
the state of your band. You all
Yeah.
it's the state of the sibling bond. But with Coen Brothers, like I mean, that's a lot of records, man. That spanning
Yeah.
multiple decades. It's like
No, you're
I
right.
could
It's a
yeah.
very good point, and it's interesting because I like, I didn't get a ton of insight into their differences or how they sort of work. I mean, I think that like you can look at kind of how they're sort of credited, and if you look at it, essentially they co-write everything together. And then for the first half of their career, Joel is solely credited as the director and Ethan is solely credited as the producer. But like people were talking to them about, a Coen Brothers, they still labeled their films a Coen Brothers film. And I think that there was some, talk of like the DGA, it used to be and more reluctant to grant kind of duo status to people. They've loosened up a little bit on that. And then I believe it's from, ironically, the Lady Killers on was the first time that they were credited both as the director and the producer. So they took both of them took all three credits for the first time, I believe, on the Lady
Nice.
Killers, and then from then on. And then you look at sort of, and at least what Oscar told me was just that like they basically are two people with the same brain. Like they
Right.
finish each other's sentences, they know exactly what each other is going to say. It's not as if one person deals with this part of it and one person deals with that part of it. Like you could ask either one of them the same question, and if they didn't hear each other answer it, they'd give you the same answer. So that was pretty interesting. But then you look at their two films that now they've released in kind of quick succession, and they couldn't be more different. I mean, like, I think that, Macbeth, which I also don't love, but like is pretty visually arresting and obviously, serious and, epic in a way, and Drive Away Dolls is sort of a trifle and I think has funny moments to it, but like doesn't really work. But it's not. It's visually, I think, pretty bad. And so it's sort of like, how do you, and even, but even doing that, I don't think is fair to kind of like, uh, say, well, Joel's good at the visuals and Ethan's good at the comedy or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
I'm sure it's not that. I think that I'm sure that there's a sort of like alchemy
Well,
that only exists when they're together.
let's extend that band analogy, because I would say that unlike, Liam and Noel Gallagher, who I mean, maybe diehard Oasis fans are gonna, fucking
They're
fry
gonna
me for
come
this
for
one, but
you,
yeah, but I don't believe they were very productive outside of that band. I think it's that band broke
right?
up,
No, I've
and
heard
it's
the
not
same
like
thing. Yeah,
it's not a rich, I think that unfortunately or fortunately, certainly unfortunately for them, but they need that friction to come back together and make more music. And maybe it was always at odds. I think obviously the creative collaboration between the Coen Brothers seems like it's been a lot more harmonious and that it was able to last multiple decades. I think it would have to be. But
yeah,
usually what somebody does when they want to make a solo record is that they want to deviate from the plot of what their band does. So you look at a band even like Animal Collective, they all go out and they do other records. There's a Panda Bear record that just came out, last month. The two of them worked on it. It was Deacon from the band, who I believe produced it. But there's these ideas that, you write one for you, and then you write another one that's maybe for the band, and that it might make sense in the context of that. And especially if you're in the democracy of a band, you're probably determining, which songs make it into the record. So you could say that, like, if these two films are strikingly different from one another, it's probably because this is the incongruencies that they couldn't find overlap in. You could say that
right.
maybe this is the kind of movie that one brother wouldn't want to work on, and sometimes you got to get the, if you're just trying to get, clear inventory, then maybe they need to do this. But it's different with music, where you could just do that in a log cabin in a weekend by yourself. You're not necessarily, no one's getting up at 6 a.m. toasting bagels,
Right.
to make a movie where you're just working some shit out.
But no, it is interesting, and I have always kind of wondered by that, because also doesn't like isn't there like a Radiohead spinoff that's like Tom York and Johnny Greenwood?
There's like four, dude. Yeah.
But like, I'm just like, I don't understand. Like, what do you just really want to leave out like the bassist? Like, you're like mad at him like this month, and we're starting a side project. Like,
it can be as petty as that, or it can be as principled as it's not Radiohead unless we're all in the room. And that's kind of, I mean, that's how it is with Animal Collective. I mean, not to single them out as a band that, like, by principle or by design, they're like, if this person doesn't want to work on this record, then we just call it something else.
The other interesting. Yeah. Oh, go no. Finish your thought.
But sorry. I was gonna. To speculate also that, like, the two standouts in Radiohead definitely, seem to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Tom York and Johnny Greenwood. So, but maybe, and also you never know. There's maybe legal reasons, but I would like to think that in a civilized world, the idea is that they come together to make these records, but if there are additional explorations, that they like, because the Tom York solo records are very clearly defined as his solo records.
Like, that makes sense to me. But then, as soon as you're making something with Tom York and Johnny Greenwood, like, how is that not just Radiohead? Like,
it's because it's not in Phrygian. Sorry, that's a dorky music joke. But it's, because that's the scale. Like, it's Dorian or Phrygian. That's a fucking Radiohead song, if I ever heard one. From Everything in Its Right Place to Pyramid Song. But there's, I think there's certain modes or things that they know to expect from their fans, or what their fans might expect, which is a healthier relationship than most people have with their fan base.
Yes.
So to say that if you want more that isn't necessarily within the confines of what this band is influenced by, and pretty much now at this point it's influenced by itself. I mean, there are moments when they go back to this sort of can thing that I think, was the original blueprint for some of their earlier records, but it does seem to be this thing where, they have other directions that they want to spiral into, and who knows, maybe the drummer and the bass player are like, yo, I don't want to make math rock or whatever, whatever this new small record sounds like. And they're like, cool, we'll go off and do it on our own. But I think, again, it boils down to this legacy thing where, like, once you have a body of work that people are, comparing whatever you just put out to, whether it be a film or a record or a new single or a new project, I mean, it's just it eventually, it starts being weighed against you on your best day, you on your best release. And I maybe it's a way in my mind, if the Coen brothers want to make these kind of different smaller movies and they don't necessarily want to go through the pain of what, especially now, harder than ever to raise the kind of budgets that they used to
Yeah.
get to make these insane films, maybe this is a way to kind of continue to be creative in a lower stakes capacity so that it's not people being disappointed in the past saying like, what, you're going to follow up, No Country for Old Men with Burn After Reading, and then them saying like, oh, well, shit. I don't
Well, we
wanna,
want to. It's fuck you. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, for sure.
I do kind of totally get that. The other wrinkle of this too is that like is that that's interesting is that the only other work that I'm aware of that they've done separately is that Ethan has written a couple books of short stories, novels, and plays by himself.
Gotcha.
Which is also very interesting. And like I've only read his book of short stories called Gates of Eden, which is excellent, and
Okay.
I highly recommend it. But it's very interesting because it's like, which also, by the way, I believe is named after a Bob Dylan song. Gates of Eden is a great Bob Dylan song, and it's an interesting book of short stories that like is a combination of like a sort of, there's some kind of complete short stories that feel like that. Some of them are just like, here's a monologue. Some of it
Right.
is just like feels like the opening of a movie that just like then doesn't go anywhere. So it does feel like a repository of like ideas that didn't fit into movies. And then I'm curious about, I have not read his, I think he has a novel called The Drunken Driver Has the Right of Way, which is a
Nice.
great title. And
Excellent.
and then the other one is called The Day the World Ends, which I think is just poems. So anyway, anyone interested in thinking about more about their work, but Gates of Eden is an excellent book. Oh, we should mention, I guess I wanted to just talk about like the soundtrack for a second, as we should mention that the executive music producer of this movie was T-Bone Burnett, who's like a sort of legendary figure. He also was in charge of the music on "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," sort of famously, which that movie I think might have be the only movie in history to have its soundtrack outsell its grosses
Right.
as a movie. And that I do love that movie, and that soundtrack is amazing as well.
Well, I mean, it's funny because now even thinking about both of those movies, it seems to be, I guess, in the way that American folklore, or sorry, American folk music is also just tied to these sort of myths that I guess in this
Yeah.
case, like how America mythologizes itself through song, and you think about the Great American Songbook, but even the things that predate that, you think about gospel music and how that eventually sort of led to the creation of the blues and rock and roll and all this stuff, the Dust Bowl era folk music. But I think that it's interesting that those two films kind of come from the same place, because if one is based on the Iliad, right?
The
Or the
Odyssey.
the
Yeah.
Odyssey. Yeah. Okay. So if
It's based on Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. Yes.
exactly. But if it
Uh,
is this epic poem, if it is essentially intended to sort of play out like the Odyssey, why wouldn't it steep itself in the mythology of the country that it takes place in?
right. No, I think that's a great point. I think that's kind of exactly right. And the cat in Inside Llewyn Davis is named Ulysses. I think aptly as well for that reason. And you
Which I
know,
love. I love that he walks by. He walks by the movie poster for that Disney film. Oh
yes, The
God.
Incredible Journey, which
Yes.
like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the Reddit heads use for the time loop argument, because that movie didn't come out until 1963 and the movie takes place in 1961.
Oh, shut the fuck up.
Or they just didn't give a shit
They
because they
just didn't
wanted the
give a shit.
visual joke.
Yeah.
And I mean, I do think the cat is as they say as well, is a very important part of the film. I mean, I love, again, it's very Coen Brothers, where he's in the beginning of the film where he's holding the cat and talking on the payphone, and the woman is misunderstanding him. He's trying to say,
I
"I
am the
have
cat.
the cat," and she says, "Llewyn is the
The
cat,"
cat.
and it's like, yeah, okay, we get it, guys. Thank you very much.
I mean,
We will pay
amazing
attention
setup.
to the cat. Like, we
And
got it.
it's surprisingly sentimental when you, because I was like, are they gonna show when he closes the door on the cat? Is this gonna be a moment where you get a reverse shot of a cute cat? And they went there, and I thought that was
Yeah.
ballsy, because I was like, dude, in anyone else's film, if you, or even just the slight mishandling of the tone, that scene is just a cheap, like a cheap sentimental ploy. But again, it's, I
Right.
mean, he just further debases himself, toward marching
And
towards
it
his goal.
shows that he's kind of a bad guy.
Yeah,
Like, he
yeah.
really is. Like, that whole journey, like, where he drives past Akron without saying anything. I guess we should explain, like, there's a great, like, Carrie Mulligan tells him she's pregnant, it might be his, and because it might be his, she wants to get an abortion. She's making him pay for it. That, like, leads to his more desperate need for money. He gets the money together, he goes to pay the doctor, and the doctor tells him that
That
essentially,
he has
this one's
credit.
free of charge. You have credit at the abortion
So
doctor,
fucked.
because the last one you paid for, she never did it. And this is news to him. And so, he basically comes to understand that he has a child, in Akron, that he's never met. And when he's going to Chicago or coming back, they drive past it, and he doesn't say anything.
Yeah,
And
and
then,
he accidentally kills the cat too. That's
and then
the
he accidentally, and like and he leaves the cat behind, and
I mean, he kills another cat, but in the symbology of the film,
yes, right.
yeah.
And but I kind of like, there's something that I kind of love about that, and I do think that, like, Oscar is a charismatic and sort of
If he
empathetic performer, that you still are kind of with him, even though you see him being a piece of shit.
Wait, so you're saying that if he is the cat, and on his journey, his visual journey, propelling forward, he hurts himself. He's his own worst enemy. Is that what you're trying to say, Joel
Yeah,
and
I think
Ethan? Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. Or the other stupid thing I read was that the cat was the sort of uh you know ghost of Mike, essentially, that he's like
Oh,
carrying
I like that
he's
interpretation
carrying
too.
he's carrying the baggage of Mike
Wow.
around and can't get rid of it. I mean, again, like, these things sound kind of dumb when you say them out loud, but these are things that are in a film like this. Like,
Of
these,
course, yeah.
like, and that's why they're better when they're not said out loud. Like, they're better as metaphor or symbol or theme. And I just think the Coens are so kind of good at, like, infusing their stuff with those things. Like, it's so funny when, like, the Gorfines realize that he brought the wrong cat
Yeah.
back. Like, those people are so the Gorfines are so good. They're so, like,
He
the
does not
Coens are
deserve
so
people
good
like
at
the Gorfines
casting,
in
like,
his life.
faces. It was also like, I was watching this with my girlfriend, and we had a few months ago, like, rewatched all of Girls, and, like, man, there are a lot of people from Girls in this fucking movie.
Sure.
They both shot in New York at around the same time. You got Alice Karpovsky.
Mm-hmm.
Hannah's dad plays Mr. Gorfine,
Oh wow.
and you got Adam Driver, and there might be, like, another one or two in there, but it's just funny to see, like,
I will
all
say,
these same New York actors pop up.
as a musician, I feel like I have some Gorfines in my life, where, like, as I've been on the road, there's like a sweet couple that I know that always have a couch for me if I'm passing
Right.
through town. That is, uh there's a certain mercy, I'll say, that is allotted to the traveling musician that honestly probably shouldn't, but just people are sweet and music is
Right.
charming, and
And they
they
get
will
to feel cool. They get to feel
they get
cool.
to feel
Like that.
cool. They get to feel this is
That's
our
like,
yeah.
I think that's what the gore finds are doing, which is also why it's like while I totally get it's not cool to expect somebody to be a traveling monkey, it's like,
Sure.
well, they're giving you a bed and a meal for free, dude. The least you could do is like play
Playing a
us a
couple
ditty, you
songs.
know?
Yeah. Fair. Completely
But
fair.
I also get his feeling too, and it's a good just the way she gets so upset by his swearing is so funny. She just like has to leave the room,
Well,
like
they need to
it's
emphasize, because also his sister does the same thing, and there's even
right,
there's a
right,
shot,
right.
I think, when he's at the publishing at the publisher's office, where the assistant or secretary, she also kind of like, side eyes him a little bit for cursing. So I guess, we will say that this did take place in the early '60s, and as much as
Yeah.
we've been Tarantino-fied or David Mamet-fied,
Right. Right.
uh,
Yes.
yeah, that I guess just to I thought that was a nice touch to give it context and using it as a comedic device, because he also, right after he curses, that's when he tells his nephew, he's just like, your uncle's a bad man.
Yes, and he sure is. I'll say, and I think we can kind of start to wrap up, but
Yeah.
the movie was released and got great reviews and did decently enough. I don't think it was terribly expensive. It was released by the now defunct CBS Films, which was like a
Right.
weird thing that existed for a little while.
Well, they probably had the publishing on those folk songs, man.
Maybe they do. Maybe they do. Maybe that's why. Uh, and or at least, I mean, I don't know if it's defunct necessarily, but it's like they're not actively releasing stuff anymore. It's sort of like a weird thing. And then, there was a lot of talk of, Oscar getting, an Oscar nomination, obviously. And I think it was very much the best performance of the year. He did manage to get a Golden Globe nomination because there's double the nominees because there's 5 in comedy and 5 in drama.
Right.
I would wager that he was probably 6th place, at the Academy Awards and just didn't make it. But as we saw with this year, the best performance of the year was Marianne Jean-Baptiste in Hard Truths, and a lot of times they're not recognized in their time. She also didn't get nominated this year, which is insane. But I think that now with it sort of being in the Criterion Collection and it feels like it has really solidified its place as one of the Coens' best films and one of their beloved films. Maybe not quite at the level of Fargo or The Big Lebowski or No Country for Old Men, but it's definitely in the top tier of for the heads, and I think that that's a great legacy for it to have. It's a movie I can watch at any time. I listen to the soundtrack all the time. I have, a poster from the concert hanging in my living room. So it's a special movie for me, and I'm glad we got to talk about it.
Well, as long as you never have a Mumford and Sons poster in your living room, we can continue to record this podcast.
Deal. Thanks for listening to This Podcast Should Be Played Loud, created, produced, and hosted by Chad Harbold and Alan Palomo. Please remember to rate, review, and follow on your favorite podcast platform, and keep up to date on new free and bonus episodes at patreon.com/This Podcast Should Be Played Loud. Our artwork is by Robert Beatty, and special thanks to Marie Barty and Jorge Palomo.